We have a group of friends gathered here today to share some of their experiences about growing up in South Florida. Some of these stories are from the past, others are from more recent, but they all have one thing in common: race. Let's have a dialogue.
Hi, I'm Priscilla Dames, and I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and it was true Midtown, USA. My mother worked at a factory. My father was a pastor of a church, 5 children, and I think we were very cocooned. And the reason I'm saying that is because there was so much going on in the Midwest, but all we knew is that we went to church, we were happy. Wasn't a lot of money, but we didn't realize it because we did things like go to camp every year. Not like the camp they talk about now, but it was the sleepover camp. And my mother believed in giving us lots of experiences, so we went on field trips. I had a great childhood, and eventually I was the first one that went to college out of my family. You know, one thing that people don't realize is that if you're a minority of any type and you have been that minority too, because there's some minority situations that the child is in that category and the parents are not, like when a child is gay, for an example, you don't know what to do. But if you're black, so when you have your children, you already know what the world out here is like. So you start off cocooning your child at the very, very, very beginning. Because my first husband and I are very dark, very short, very hairy. So my first child was, and so I would tell him things like, "Oh, look at that skin. Oh my goodness, that's so beautiful. Oh, you're so beautiful." And I would tell him all the time that he was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. "Joseph, go get your book." So he would never go get a toy when we were leaving the house. His extension of his arm was always a book. So you're learning how to cocoon your children, how to give them a different angle and getting them ready for the real harsh world out here. As a mother of a black son especially, I have a daughter, but you can look at the stats. I have the stats. We know the things that have happened to our black male children in this country, in South Florida, in Miami. Read the stats. If you have a black child, it takes you to a whole different level because you are afraid every single day that something's going to happen to your black son.
The first story about Priscilla. What do y'all think about Priscilla's story?
Well, when I think that she said about cocooning to date, as we do, I believe that sometimes we need to leave our kids alone, let them be with each other, instead of putting our own opinion to their brains. I've noticed that you let kids play, they don't know anything about race. They just want to play. When you start putting the ideas of your thoughts into their head, when they change their opinion about who they play with, so they're innocent. Like anything else, we as adults start controlling our kids to where we want them to be, not to where they should be on their own.
But the notion that, I mean, the statistics are there about the challenges that children of color are going to face growing up, especially here in South Florida. I mean, we read about it all the time. I mean, the tragedies that happen in this community, and the odds and the statistics about these incidents, I mean, that occur. I mean, it's just the concern that any parent would have.
When I think about it, I think about me growing up, and if they told me don't go on that side of the railroad track, I just didn't go on that side of the railroad track. I didn't ask them why. And I think that's where a barrier lie, because we don't, me coming up, I was kind of shielded away from some of the brutality of racism. I wasn't told certain things. I wasn't exposed to certain things. So I understand the cocoon, you know what I mean. But I do know that a certain extent is good, and I would say, but I don't think, and then the last part of what Ms. Daines was saying, I don't want it to overdo it. I say it that way. I think that it's a certain balance that's needed in society.
And I think about myself. I was born in 1956, Fort Lauderdale, racially segregated Fort Lauderdale, the only child of my parents. And my parents put me out there. I'm thinking cocooning was not in our vocabulary. I remember doing the wade-ins on Fort Lauderdale Beach with my parents in 1960. Went up to St. Augustine for the walks there and the marches and the wade-ins there. My dad took me to Washington, D.C. in 1963 for the March on Washington. Again, I was, 6 years old, but still I was there. And in terms of my education, Fort Lauderdale was racially segregated, all the schools were. But they eventually moved me out of an all-black school into a desegregated Catholic school. So I was one of maybe a handful of black students. And then by my 10th grade year, I was sent to Pinecrest Preparatory School in Fort Lauderdale, where I was the first and only black student out of 1,200 students. So my parents did not cocoon me. They put me right out there and informed me and encouraged me and said I would be okay. And they were behind me with that. So cocooning, yes, overall is a part of the black experience of protecting children. But at the same time, there are parents and communities that push kids not to be afraid, to go out, step out, and have faith that you will make it through. And that was the message I got.
But in both instances, isn't it full recognition of the issue of race?
Oh, absolutely.
And what you're going to confront?
Absolutely.
I mean, in your case, your parents were actively confronting,
Right.
the issues and making sure that, you were aware of the challenges. I mean, and being the only black child in a preparatory school must have been an experience.
And it wasn't just about race in that instance, it was about economics.
Right.
Because my mother was a teacher, my dad worked for the post office. The kids that I went to school with, their dads were doctors, lawyers, business people, etc. So millionaires, many of them.
Well, my question would be, how do we a cocoon person know that race exists, or know when he's being profiled, stereotyped? How do you identify that? And if you don't,
You should know that one.
huh?
Life eventually intrudes, but let's go on to the next story and see what the next story.
My name is Dr. Walter T. Richardson. I was born in Miami, in Overtown, which is called Colored Town when I was born. My family lived there for a very short time, and then we moved to the area of Miami called Liberty City. And I spent a few years there before we moved to Opelika, Florida. Actual experience with racism was when a little white girl called me a nigger. She was looking out the window. My daddy was doing odd jobs for a family and was cutting the yard. He went in the house for something to get something, and while he was gone, the little white girl came to the window, saw me, and said, "Hey, mommy, there's a nigger." And I had never heard that word used by someone other than a black person before. So I was a little shocked at that experience. That was the first time I experienced, an act of racism, being called a name other than what I knew about. And I remember when I was in the first grade, and I was 6 years old, going to get ready for school and not being able to try on my clothes in the dressing rooms because they were reserved only for white kids or white people. So, I saw a lot of acts of separation, if you don't mind, of the races. Signs were clearly marked in the South, particularly in Miami, that said white and colored. The restrooms were divided like that. The water fountains were divided like that. Facilities were divided like that, white and colored. The train station was divided. They had a white waiting room, which was air conditioned. Then they had another waiting room that was colored, that was not air conditioned. One day my daddy takes me to work with him, and I had learned about white and colored, and I went over to play with the signs. And they were, at that time, just coming out with magnetic signs. One said white, the other said colored. And before the store opened for business, I looked around to see if anybody was watching me, and I switched to signs. And I went over to the shoe department. My daddy didn't know anything about this, to watch the reaction of people who came to get water. That, to me, was funny. That was my way of handling racism in the early 50s.
Yeah, Dr. Richardson raised some interesting points. I found extremely exciting the fact that he had the initiative at such a young age to switch the signs of colored and white. I do remember those signs very much at water fountains and doctor's offices. And I don't believe I ever thought about switching and then observing the reactions of people. That would have been an interesting documentation of how people reacted at that time to the separation of people based on color. Today we have issues of real estate, where real estate agents will steer buyers to certain neighborhoods, irrespective of their economic ability to pay for a property or not. I've had friends tell me that they're going to move in one area of Broward County, an exclusive area, and the real estate agent has directed them elsewhere because of their color, not because of their financial ability to pay cash even for a property. Yeah.
I find it, I mean, hearing Dr. Richardson speak about this, I know there's kids today that can't imagine that it wasn't that long ago that in Miami that you would have the signage separating people, you know, which dressing rooms to use and such. I mean, it just, to most people, I mean, most kids that have been raised here, born after 1975, or, you know, the idea of those kind of things are probably just so foreign. Yet it's very real for you know, the older generation right here in Miami to have experienced that, you know, firsthand. And the stories of not being able to be on Miami Beach when the sun goes down. If you're a person of color, you had to be off the beach. You know, you're okay to be there during the day doing domestic work and landscaping work and assisting the white families and businesses over there, but at night you had to be off the beach. I mean, those kind of things, I mean, people have a hard time imagining that, you know, in this country, in the 50s, that was just the way things were. So, I mean, the progress we've made is tremendous in some sense. But then, of course, it continues on in different forms, like you mentioned, the realtors, steering people to different neighborhoods based on your color. I mean, it's pervasive.
And bank redlining, even. Not sending resources into certain neighborhoods because of the fact that they're predominantly black. Goes on today. Back in 2010, with the last census, when I chaired the school board's diversity committee of Broward County, we were looking at the issue of technology, and many communities don't have access to broadband computers. There's still a broadband service. So students go home to those neighborhoods and they have no way to do homework, do projects at night. As they go to the library in their neighborhoods, but the library's closed at a certain time. But if you go to places like Parkland, Weston, where the kids have access to broadband services, not on their phone, but in their computers, they can complete assignments faster and more productively than these other communities. So companies, AT&T, Comcast, and others weren't doing business, weren't providing those services to those neighborhoods. So we still have redlining, so to speak, in the technology area.
But the solution, I just heard the solution is putting whatever entity out there, making it known what's going on and doing it. Because when we talk about Miami Beach, I look at the, Memorial Day weekend, and how you have one hand beckoning you to come, and the other hand putting the stop sign up. And, you know, I look at instances like that. And the only way that that got resolved was because somebody stepped up to the plate and said, we're not going to tolerate this. And that was the only way to solve it. And I think listening to some of the other things that were pointed out is by stepping up to the plate and saying, okay, this is not tolerable anymore.
So I lived the whole situation out in Miami. I was born right in Miami. I mean, 130th Mall was a mall where you had the white and color signs. You had to ride in the back of the bus. But my thought process may be a little different than yours. I'd rather have my kids see the future as a bright future. I learned from my history, but I can't control my future. So I want my kids to understand that, yeah, you had a past. You had something that was probably negative. I don't want to look at negative. I want to see something positive. My positive is the same as that of the cross, in which I can go forward. I saw someone my same age, back in the day, supposedly I did the one, a white guy, did the beating of blacks. Because you're 70 years old, I'm not, cannot accuse you of something that happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago. I'm not going to accuse you of that. Because again, what good would that do me?
Right.
I can do something that says that it's going to be better in the future for you, though.
Well, the next story is from a woman named Vicky.
My name is Vicki Jackson. I was born on Miami Beach in 1955. Growing up in Miami, I think I had a great existence here, even though I did note that I was growing up in a separate society. My parents were both college educated, as were all of their friends, and so my life began over town, where my father had grown up, and I remember in those days going to church and going to doctors. My doctors were black, my pediatrician and my surgeon. The hotels were black. Everything was black that we needed, the movies. So our world was black until it was time to buy clothing. My grandmother sewed most of my clothes. However, occasionally we would walk downtown or ride to Richard's or Bert Hines. And I noticed when we got there that I could not try on the clothes. I had to stand up straight with my arms real straight, stand up real straight, and they would just kind of put the dress and match my shoulders and see how long it was and see if it fit around the waist. And then from there, if any alterations were needed, then my grandmother could, tell whether or not she needed to alter the dress. It was always bought too big if necessary. But I noticed that I never went into the dressing room. I had to figure that out as I grew older and learned more history, because I never heard race talked about in my home. My father was from Alabama, a very small town in Alabama. Now, once I was there, I knew I was in a different place. I just didn't realize it here in Miami. And I went to Spain, and I just didn't sense. I really had a sense that, hey, I'm a citizen of the universe, and I don't have to be careful in certain places. I knew when I went to Alabama and in Georgia, I had to be very careful about certain things, and there was a certain way to act that I didn't feel in Miami per se. And then when I went to Europe, when I went to Spain, it kind of just really opened my eyes. I came back to protest being called the N-word and those kinds of things. No one's ever called me personally the N-word, but I know people who've been, called the word and things like that. So I would say that my upbringing is a little different, but the first 10 years of my life was in segregation.
It's interesting to hear Ms. Jackson talk about growing up here in Miami and how she was almost sensed that there was the segregationalist life that was happening here in Miami, but it didn't throw her off too much, and she wasn't fully aware of it until she actually left Miami. and her visit to Spain. Milton, you mentioned earlier about your travels overseas.
Well, I was able to go to China. Once I was in China, it's a very recent part of the last 10 years. And in China, I kind of realized something. Not so much as my color, as it was of us being a free country. One thing that was told to me about the guide there was that, be careful what you say. With a museum, they have microphones. You speak against the government or something negative, they'll come get you and arrest you right now. Like, I'm from America, I can say anything I please. No, not there you can't. You would go to jail. It kind of made me wonder about something. We over here talk about how much we are prejudiced about each other. But our freedom itself is a goal which we all should be going toward freedom. And we have it here. Outside of this country, freedoms are not a given product. It's something that they're fighting every day for, today, just to be free to speak their mind. So for me, it opened my eyes up to a lot of this. I don't see black and white as much as I have to see that I have to be free. And same thing as being free, it's also our religion. You can't, if you're not Christian or you're Catholic or you're Protestant, whatever your religion is, you can't practice that in some other countries. So we have a lot of privileges and rights here that we take for granted until you go see it somewhere else, and it changes your perspective of the world itself.
But I mean, even those of us here, though, I mean, to hear Ms. Jackson's story about growing up here in Miami, I mean, the freedoms that we take for granted, in many ways, I mean, it was a struggle to get the freedoms that we enjoy here, even culturally. I mean, I think we have a lot of protections constitutionally, but then the cultural freedoms, I mean, I think have been earned day by day, year by year among our people.
As I said, I've lived and worked in over 85 nations on 5 continents. I've been to China. Racism is a universal. Anti-black racism is a universal. And she talked about Spain. It's interesting, 3 years ago, Dr. Henry Louis Gates from Harvard did a series for PBS called Black in Latin America, where he looked at Cuba, Dominican Republic, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, and looked at the issue of race and racism that still exists in 2011. 2011, by the way, was the United Nations year for the international recognition of people of African descent. And when we look at the word negro, negro is black in Spanish. That was one of the first names that the Africans who were brought from Africa into Spain and finally into the Americas were called negro. And we still have that word today, Negroes. And when I went to the Philippines and found that many people spoke Spanish there, I learned that Spain had been a colonizing agent in the Philippines for over 400 years. There's a group of people in the Philippines called the Negritos, the little black people, and they have been discriminated against, even with that influence. And you go throughout Central and South America and the Caribbean, and Dr. Gates made it clear that racism is alive and well in the 21st century. So when she said she went to Spain and had a different experience, well, I'm not sure how long she was in Spain. I'm not sure where she was in Spain. Right. I've been to Spain, and there are issues related to being black.
Well, and then bringing it home to Miami and South Florida. I mean, we have all those peoples living among us in Miami. Right. So it's almost like the interaction of the cultures here in Miami. I mean, we must be a test pattern for maybe the rest of the United States on this issue as we interact with so many people from different places. Let's go on to the next story.
My name is Leona Johnson. I was born in Tampa, Florida. I was brought to Miami when I was 1 month old. Went to North Dade School. It was during the time of segregation. and we had everything was in, we call it a center, where we had the fish market, the grocery store, everything that we would need in order to make things, you know, do things for your home and everything. We had all kind of teachers and doctors and lawyers and everything that lived in our neighborhood. And everybody raised us. It wasn't just our parents, it was the whole neighborhood. And we went to I went to North Dade for about 3 years, and then they phased out North Dade and sent us to Carroll City when they did integration. And they didn't want us at Carroll City. The whites over there didn't want us there. So when we got there, it was an awful lot of fighting. They fought every day because the blacks didn't want to be there, the whites didn't want us there. And when we got there, we found out it was so different because the school there, the white school there, which was Carroll City, they had the auto mechanics program where they worked on the cars. They had the graphics arts where they taught them photography. They had the wood shop class, and they made all kind of different things. They had the record keeping and bookkeeping classes. They had a lot of things that we didn't have at North Dade, the black school. And I never had any problems with being black. I never had any problems with anybody white or any other color, you know, because that's not how we were raised. My parents raised us to respect and love everybody. I didn't get upset with anyone unless they did something to me personally. You know, that's when I had a problem. And as I got older, graduated from high school, got married and everything, I had a son. And the things that I had to teach my son was just unreal. Before he can go out, I would have to make sure he understood if the police ever stop you, you gotta put your hands on the steering wheel. You can't make any false move. You gotta always say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. And he couldn't understand it. It was hard for him to grasp that. And we had quite a few incidents. And he would different ones would be in our neighborhood, and they were in unmarked cars, and try to pull him over. And he would never stop. He would always bring him to the house, because he said he want somebody to know what's going on. And it was like, it was so different. We had the first black police officer in Opelika, and it was like, you didn't believe that this is how things were supposed to be. I just couldn't believe or accept that this is how it's supposed to be. We're all supposed to be equal, you know? Something happened to a person because they've done something, not just because the color of your skin. And it was so hard for me to try to explain this to my son. But anyway, we got through it, and thank God, it took a long time for him to really understand why he had to do certain things. He said, "My mama, I'm not doing anything. It makes no difference. This is how we had to do certain things."
What Ms. Johnson had to say, unfortunately, I think is the sad truth today, just as much as it was for her when she was raising her son. I mean, I think the truth is the profiling that occurs, I mean, you know, is a reality. I mean, people get pulled over and
Today.
and questioned based on the color of their skin. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, and I think you do have to educate your children and caution them and warn them of the realities. It's just a reality that occurs, and it occurs in Miami, and it certainly occurs throughout the U.S.
Yeah, Ms. Johnson brought up something that went unsaid for a long time. And how do we as human interact with another human, more so than anything, even if that human is authority, an authority figure? And how do we communicate, and what do we put together to make sure that person do make it home alive, or without getting beat, or without going to jail, without that fear? And that's a very hard question, because I don't have the answer. you know, I see when some people interact with the police, they can ask the police questions. But I know on several personal occasions, I couldn't ask no question out of fear of going to jail. And that's why I say it kind of hit home with me with that one. Because I see what's happening now is that a lot of the kids getting a loitering or prowling charge, and they say resisting arrest.
Well, I mean, it does happen all the time. I mean, my son-in-law, I mean, he was riding in a car in the back seat, and because he had an expired driver's license, was taken to jail. I mean, I thought it was the most absurd thing I'd ever. I said, well, you were not driving, but you had an expired license. But, you know, being African American, I mean, that was, you know, he was swept up with everybody else and taken to be processed for having an expired driving or riding in a car with an expired license.
I'm thinking, flashing back to 1973. I'm coming home on a Saturday morning from a speech contest, forensics. 2 trophies, and the first place trophies, and I'm in my back seat. I was driving a Camaro at the time, and I was stopped. And the policeman said that my car and I matched a description of someone who attempted to rape a young girl. Now, I had just driven in from Miami now. I didn't have time to rape anybody or attempt. But this is what was said. My skin color, and the car. So after questioning me, I told them I went to Pinecrest. They called the school that Monday to confirm it. But they let me go. There was no issue. Because I proved to them, I said, listen, I've been in Miami all day at this event. When I went home, both my parents took me back to the police station and asked to speak with this officer's superior. And they let him have it right there in the office and said, you know, our son, and they told him all about my background and what I've been doing and what I do in the community and how I've been recognized, and that to treat him this way was not right. The second time, I went to Cornell University. This was my freshman year. I come back home with a friend of mine from school. He was white. We were driving along not Los Olas, but Sunrise and A1A, coming back from the beach. All of a sudden, we're surrounded by police cars. Get out of the car, you know, and we got up, your hands up, guns drawn at us, all right? Here we are, 2 Ivy League students enjoying our holiday break at home. And again, after they asked us questions, asked where we were coming from, where we were going, we were not the people who they said were described as someone who attempted to do something to somebody else. So that's a reality. 2 years ago, we had a family reunion here in Miami. And I gave a talk about walking while black, not just driving while black, but walking. And I used Trayvon Martin as an example, and how just walking, he was targeted, he was profiled, and we saw what happened with him. So this is an ongoing reality. No matter what community you're in, no matter what kind of education you have, if you're black, you're subject to these kinds of assaults.
Well, let's go on to the next story.
First experience I had is related to race back in 1942 when we moved from Overtown to Liberty City. As far as having to ride the bus from Liberty City over town. Now they had the little buses that they had at that time. Dade County was not involved. There was no such thing as Dade County buses. You had to go into the front door. I experienced this with my mother. You go in the front door, you put your nickel in, it was a nickel, and you come out that front door and go in that back door to go into that bus. We all know we had to sit on that back bench. Now, if the driver, which I've seen it happen as a youngster, didn't want to wait on you, he's going with your nickel and you're still standing there and the bus is going. Now, as a youngster, that was devastating for me. because I was always a youngster with an open mind and understanding, and I observe and I look and see the different things that I come up under. Now that was really rough, riding them buses. Now as far as if they didn't want to wait on you, if you're standing on the bus stop, they pass on by you, because the buses ran from Overtown to Liberty City. Then they had one running into Brown Sub, which was number 24. Liberty City was 21. Overtown was 20. There were 3 buses. Today, they still have those numbers on the buses that they kind of use now. But I think about that quite a bit, and if a white person wanted to sit on that back seat, which is called a back bench, I experienced it, had to get up. And just one white person sitting at that whole bus bench area. Now that was told to be for black people only, behind that back door. That's where we sit. And I experienced that. But if one white wanted to sit back there where we were, that door behind the seat behind that door, you all get up. All of us had to get up. Let that one person there, if they want that bench, and I would never forget that. We all had to get up and they sit there themselves.
Now, Mr. Dean lived that, and he remembers it very well. You know, I mean, what do we have comparable that's going on today? You know, for people that are experiencing the racism in South Florida.
Well, what comes to my mind as he was speaking was the phrase white privilege, because even though the back of the bus at that time was reserved for blacks, if a white person wanted it to sit in the back, they could, and blacks had to move. Today we have other examples. There are 40, 50 different examples that have been identified by scholars of examples of white privilege, where blacks, people of color may be displaced or are displaced. And it's still, in my view, an ongoing problem, an ongoing issue. It's not the back of the bus now, it's the neighborhood you live in. It's whether you can purchase a car with cash and not be an expensive car and not be considered a drug dealer. How did you get the money? Where did the money come from? Just because you're black. Not to mention that you may have been an investor, or you may have earned your money in other legitimate ways. But when you step out and want to buy a house, a mansion, the question is, and you want to pay cash for it, the question is, well, you're black, where did you get the money to do that? Obviously, you got it illegally. But a white person, on the other hand, has privilege. People can fly in here from Venezuela with cash and buy a mansion in Weston, and nobody says anything, thinks twice about it. A white Venezuelan, not a black Venezuelan. So these are the realities we're living with today.
Well, you're right. I, as a property inspector, I go all over South Florida, inspecting property, inspecting mansions, $2 million, $4 million homes. When I drive up, I ask your ID. Don't ask your ID. I have to tell the people my credentials, why I'm qualified to come be an inspector. Right? Interesting. Had a white guy came up here and said he's an inspector, you wouldn't have said a word to him and kept right on going. I said it to you because I've seen it, I felt it, and I'm going to tell you what I've said. That person who did it to me, he's ignorant, doesn't know any better, and he felt like he had some kind of authority he wanted to exercise on me. And I always say this, I think God fights my battles for me. So with that being said, it's an experience to which I can't blame a white person for what happened to me, because he was the same person that did it to me. But what I do say this is that you have thread very, very lightly by being of color into areas of influence and where you're supposedly not supposed to be. I can't go and Key Biscayne and ride down Key Biscayne in my car without a Key Biscayne officer can come behind me. What am I doing riding to keep this game? Me and my family, Sunday, me and my family is riding around looking at houses, just enjoying our drive. But because we're black, they ride behind us. See where I'm going. I'm a little cocky, so I'm kind of like, I go to 7-Eleven, hopefully they follow me at 7-Eleven, so I can ask them, hey, how you doing? I like to confront things in a roundabout way to let them know that, yes, I'm black, yes, I'm here, and if I'm not doing a crime, you leave me alone. You said something earlier about how people aren't black. I think that if you're anything but white, Irish, so-called Anglo-white, you have a problem. Further up than we have here now, further up into Central Florida. Also, we need to make sure that as blacks, make sure that we understand authority we cannot beat in the street.
Well, I can tell you, I mean, as a white person, I mean, I never have to think about driving like I'm going to get pulled over because I'm just driving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those kind of things, those kind of thoughts don't occur to me because I know it doesn't happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I know. I mean, to me, it's like, the idea that, and I know I can blow past security in most places. I just walk in. And there is this, like, I'm a white guy, and it's like, no one stops to ask, excuse me, what are you doing here? I mean, you can walk past security, whether it's in a hospital or a courthouse or something. Sometimes you just walk right by. I mean, they just assume,
You belong.
like you know where you're going, and they're not going to challenge it. So, I know, in these different scenarios, whether it's a private fundraising party or something, you can walk in, and people don't challenge it. Even though there's a desk that you're supposed to check in, you can do that.
Right.
See, when I went to the race exhibit, when I first came in, when I walked through that door, on the right side, it was a Trayvon Martin exhibit. It was something, and it asked a question, and it had 4 different replies. 3 of those replies said that they didn't even care what happened. They didn't care. How do we reach those people that Mr. Dean was just referring to? That person that was driving that bus that pulled off, knowing that this person had been paid their hard-earned money, knowing that they paid it to go around and come through the back door, and the guy just pull off. How do we confront those types of people? Or how do we address those types of situations of people?
I'm thinking of an experience that just happened in Broward County a few years ago. Go Riverwalk magazine is the magazine of downtown Fort Lauderdale. They publish a magazine every month. And they did a series on the future, the next 100 years of Fort Lauderdale. And on the cover of the magazine, and I have a picture here, they had this big, fat, white baby. And they had 10 articles written by key people in the community about what they thought the future of Fort Lauderdale will be. Well, this is what that was the cover.
Right.
And then these were the people who were invited: the mayor of Fort Lauderdale, school board member, the wife of a builder, etc. No blacks, no Native Americans, no Hispanic, no Asians. So I wrote a letter. This is what I did to address this issue. I mean, the article, the publication was already done. I wrote an article to Cindy Hutchison, editor-in-chief, Go Riverwalk magazine, copied it to Jack Seiler, who was the mayor. He was the co-editor.
Right.
And I wrote a long letter. I congratulated them on their ongoing racism, white racism. And I basically said, do not other people have visions of the future? Can't we all put in views of the future? Well, she called me back, very insulting, very who are you? Who are you to be writing me, asking me these questions? The magazine was already published. She's no longer the editor. She's been in jail. She's out now for something else. And they changed the whole editorial board of that magazine.
Well, that's a perfect
now there's
example
changes.
of challenging it,
difference.
educating her, and maybe her awareness levels increased
Right.
immensely.
So that's an example of what one person can do.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next story.
My name is Marion Evans, and I'm a native Floridian. We were raised like in the projects in Tampa, but our parents we never felt like we were poor, because in the project it was like an upstairs and downstairs. We were able to go to like black schools, and I didn't really experience a lot of racism until I got to Miami. The real brunt of racism until Trayvon Martin's death. Trayvon Martin was my grandson. And you know, you would vote, but you wouldn't be aware of the laws and everything. But then it seemed like it was such discrimination when he was killed, because it seemed like nobody wanted to listen to his story because he was not here to tell it. My daughter and Tracy, we all sat in that courtroom thinking that any day they were going to come out with some evidence to show that he was innocent. It never happened.
The tragedy of Trayvon, I mean, an innocent, a complete innocent, losing his life based on trappings of garments and racism. I mean, to me, the fact that this occurs now, when so many of the current generation don't know the stories of what happened here in Miami over the last decades. I mean, they've grown up in a kind of a mixed race society. And a lot of kids these days, I'm very proud of them because they have a lack of awareness and they seem to just look past color. I mean, we witness that in the kids that are born, the millennials. They seem to look past color, and I'm proud of them for that. But then we still have the vestiges of racism every day. I mean, like the story you just told of the future of Fort Lauderdale, like it's an all-white society. I mean, to me, the reality of it, and how do we move our community forward? What do we do to continue to diminish the residuals of racism and move to a new society where people are truly a bit colorblind?
A pastor told me one time, he said that, don't worry too much about it. Every 150 years, God cleans this earth for a new generation of people to go forward with. Every 150 years. I've thought about that. 50 years, every 20 years, a new generation. We have a long way to go. We're sitting here today talking about Trayvon Martin. I was there personally in Sanford when the first march went about. And I felt that, maybe just me, I felt that we had to demonstrate to show that it's not going to just be swept under the rug.
Right.
And I felt that he wasn't the first. And let's get something. He was not the first. He's not going to be the last. Has happened since then to today. But the idea of it is that our way of announcing things has to be sound in a yelling and loud manner, not calm and collected. If we go back to our race riots and things of that nature, someone had to die first before it sounded a horn or announcement to make things aware of what's going on in a bad or racist manner.
But what can we do in South Florida to kind of like set the pace for the rest of the country?
I'm thinking, well, we need to set the pace for our community first before we start telling anyone else. Two things. One, in 1993, the state of Florida's legislature passed a state mandate requiring that all schools provide education about black history, black contributions before slavery and after slavery. So going all the way back to the kingdoms and the ways of living in life in Africa itself. That was a mandate by the legislature. If you walk into any school today, you'd be hard-pressed to find any conscious, deliberate education about the contributions of black people to the making of this world and this country in particular, and this state. As chair of the school board of Broward's diversity committee, I had a chance to go into most of the schools, monitoring where the school district stood on a lawsuit settlement agreement, its compliance. The school district has never been in compliance with the lawsuit settlement agreement of 2000, requiring a whole bunch of issues in every area, technology, textbooks. But one of the things that I noticed walking into classrooms, especially in February, students were learning about every other group but the contributions of black people. That's Black History Month. I remember walking into one classroom and they were reading the Diary of Anne Frank, which is the story of a Jewish girl in Europe and what she went through. And my question to the teacher was, are you all reading any other books up from slavery, for example, or Souls of Black Folk, or The Miseducation of the Negro? And she said, no, this is part of what I'm doing in my class. I left it alone. So we need to put pressure on our school boards, not only in South Florida, but throughout the state, to become compliant with that state mandate, that 1993 mandate. Secondly, a few years ago, Tavis Smiley wrote a book. Well, he edited the book, the 10 Covenants with Black America. And they identified 8 different areas where black people as individuals can contribute to the improvement of their lives. Health and well-being, education, criminal justice, police accountability, affordable neighborhoods, voting, rural development, economic prosperity, environmental justice, and the digital divide, which I talked about earlier.
Right.
And they give out specific things that an individual can do. You don't need to have a group, you don't need to have a march or anything. Just one person can write a letter, can make a phone call, can write an article, an op-ed piece. I've written many op-ed pieces about why are black students suspended more than white students in Broward County. And that got the whole district moving in towards eliminating the school-to-prison pipeline. Ultimately, that's what it does. When you keep a kid out of school, whether it's 1 day, 3 days, 5 days for suspension, they fall behind. And most of the kids who that's happening are black. And I've worked in prisons. I've worked at the other end where I see these young people age through the system, become adults, do the same crime, end up in jail, in prison. So we need, what Tavis Smiley and his group have done, I think has given us a good blueprint to work with. I also tell people Dr. King wrote 7 books. The last one was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. In all of his books, but in that book in particular, he lays out what we as individuals can do to address all of the issues we've been discussing today. When he was killed, when he was assassinated, the black civil rights movement was aborted, as I call it. It died. He was moving into the area of economics.
Right.
And they cut him off. And the leaders who followed him didn't have the wherewithal to continue. So we're still in 1968 when it comes to economic realities of black people in this community. So Tavis Smiley, I think, and his group have provided some steps, and they give you basic steps, things that you can do in those areas to address these issues. So those are solutions, practical solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. I hear what you're saying about the Martin Luther King, and that movement, it started in the South, and what they did was they got a train to go up to Washington and set up a camp there. And after Dr. King got killed, everybody thought that Kennedy was going to pick that mantle up and it was going to be pushed, that economics agenda would be pushed forward. But after Kennedy got killed as well, it died off. And I see that in order for things to get moving, that we as people individually, we got to stand up and move it forward and push it. And I hate the fact that all this stuff, Trayvon Martin brought about a movement. And to me, what other things that happened wouldn't have happened until the people got behind it and moved it forward. I don't think any of that stuff would have transpired at some extent. And I think that it would have been swept underneath the rug, and you know, that would have been a done deal. And I don't know how to get to that next step that people will want to do the next right thing. And I guess that's what we said, that'll be something for another show.
Well, I think we need to continue the dialogue, obviously.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that media pushes the bad things in our world compared to the good things in our world?
Wherever sells.
And they say a bad news sells better, but I tell people all the time, for every one child you see with the pants down, I'm going to show you 10 people, boys with the pants up. Because you just make that, people see bad things.
Not only that, Mill. You know, when I was looking at the media, as it relates to Trayvon, you can see something and hear something in the media. They'll come back and retract it, and then a week or so, they'll put the same thing back out there.
Right.
That was it.
Well, but I think the innocence of Trayvon, I think, and the tragedy of that situation and the raw racism that underlies it, I think was perhaps a signal moment to this generation now that doesn't have the historic awareness that we do, you know, in our age group. But I mean, that's I think a symbolic event that's maybe reawakened the discussion and the awareness for this generation. Mm-hmm. And we need to continue this dialogue in as many places possible.
Yeah.
And we need to put pressure on our school board in every city, every county, our superintendents to comply, to implement, to actively engage students in the mandate to teach Black history. Absolutely. To all students, not just to Black students.
And only got one thing, and I want each and every one of us to do our part. You know, people see me in a wheelchair and think that I can't do anything, and I focus on my abilities, not my disability, and I can do a lot of things, and I try to live with. I do stay within my limits, but as far as doing anything, getting out to a meeting, being productive in the community, I try to do.
Well, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have had this program today. So I want to thank you for inviting us to be here with you.
Yeah. Very proud.
And we'll hopefully continue this on another program in the future.
Yeah. Well, it works.
Thank you for including us.
Exactly.